Hi, everybody. We have a really special guest today on a little question and answer session we have about occupational licensing. My name is Alana Wilson. I'm the Vice President of Government Affairs and Public Relations at the NEE Center for the Study of Occupational Regulation at St. Francis University in Pennsylvania. I'll let our guest introduce himself and we'll go from there. We have a couple occupational licensing questions for you after that.
Excellent, excellent. Well, I'm really excited to be here. My name is Grier. I'm a state representative in Missouri, and I represent part of St. Louis County area, so about 39,000 people. And probably the reason why I'm here talking to you this morning is the historic bill that we just passed, bill that I had the opportunity to sponsor, which now puts Missouri in the #1 slot for regulatory reform related to occupational licensing. So we now have the most comprehensive and expansive licensing recognition law in the country, which is really exciting.
It is. We were so excited to see it. Back in February, I had the pleasure of going down to Missouri, to Jefferson City in the state capital, and taking a tour around your beautiful building, but more importantly, testifying on behalf of your bill. So would you like to tell us a little bit about your bill that was signed into law a week or so ago?
Sure. Yeah, I will try not to get too nerdy on you and go too deep into the weeds.
Go
when
for
I start
it. We love
talking
it.
about this subject, I tend to get really passionate and excited. So the real basic kind of summary of what the bill does, it allows for full license recognition and reciprocity with other states, with every other state in the entire country. So if you're coming from another state to Missouri to work, and you have a professional license and you've been in good standing in that state you're coming from, you've had your license for a year or more, Missouri will grant you a Missouri license, and you will be able to work in Missouri without having to go through duplicative training, without having to go through all of the barriers to entry that have traditionally accompanied having a professional license. So for Missouri specifically, this is really important because we have what's important about it? Well, the fact that we're not requiring a residency requirement, right? So Arizona's law was an excellent law, and but it didn't go quite as far as we've gone with this one in enabling non-residents to come to the state. It's important to Missouri because St. Louis and Kansas City are border towns, are border cities. So we have a lot of people that are coming from across state borders to work in Missouri to fill the jobs that we have, and we have a skilled worker shortage in Missouri. Everywhere I go across the state, the consistent theme I get is we have the jobs, we just don't have the right workers. So this helps with that, and it promotes economic development, economic growth.
Yeah, it's absolutely excellent. And, really seeing this bill grow and develop and just going through the stages of it from February until now when it was signed, we were just so excited to receive the news. I will say thank you so much for calling us to give us a heads up. That was amazing. It was a huge win for Missouri. It was a huge win for you. But more importantly, it's a huge win for every American who's looking just to have a right to work, right?
Yes,
So,
and Alana, before we go on, I want to say thank you to you and to the NEE Center and all the work that you all do. And for anyone who's listening right now, Alana came to Missouri and came to Jefferson City to testify in one of probably the most crucial point in the bill's life. It had passed out of the House, it was in the Senate, it was in the committee in the Senate that I was most concerned about the bill getting cut up or getting watered down, or maybe even not even getting out of committee. And Alana was able to come in, testify in favor of the bill, explain from a national standpoint why this is so important for our economy, for workers, for all of these things that it does. So thank you for coming out and helping push this through at a critical juncture in the bill's life.
I really appreciate that. It was honestly my pleasure. And if we're giving credit where credit's due, a huge shout out to Shoshana Weissman from R Street, who made the connection for us. So thank you. And of course, Dr. Edward Timmons, who is the director of our center here at the NEE Center, who is really the champion of occupational licensing reform. So thank you to both of those people as well.
Yes.
Let's dive into a couple questions here. So we'll start at the basics. What does occupational licensing mean to you?
Sure. So occupational licensing means to me personally, I'm a real estate broker. So I have a professional license. So it gives me a little bit of insight into the process and how what a license is for. you know, 1 in 4 professions now require a professional license. So it used to be 1 in 20 professions required you to get permission from the government. Now it's 1 in every 4. You've got to go to the government to ask and beg and plead, can I please work in this profession? And so it's become extremely prevalent. And my suspicion is the reason why that it has become so prevalent is not necessarily to preserve health, safety, and wellness, which is what really the original intent of professional licensing was. The goal was, let's set up some parameters, some guidelines to ensure that the health, safety, and wellness of the public is ensured, right? Well, now I think a lot of industry groups have used the government to create barriers to entry. They have used the government to put up artificial barriers to entry to limit competition in their industries, make it harder for new people to come in and create a competitive environment. But we know that a competitive environment is a good environment, and it's very good for consumers, right? We want consumers to have choices. We want consumers to be able to decide for themselves in a lot of this stuff. So professional licensing now has gotten to the point where a lot of these professions, it's so difficult to get a license, and it takes so much time that it's very prohibitive. And it's prohibitive for a number of specific groups and demographics as well. You know, prior offenders is one area, and there's a specific piece of legislation called the Fresh Start Act that we actually added into the reciprocity bill, which made it a much better bill. And frankly, it garnered much more bipartisan support. So in the Senate, we had a unanimous vote to get this bill passed. And the only reason we got that unanimous support was because we added the Fresh Start Act, which gives prior offenders a better chance at integrating into society without barriers to entry, arbitrary restrictions on their ability to get a license. So that was a huge component of it.
Yes, I'm so glad that you did bring up the Fresh Start Act and all the different components of a bill, because I did want to move into what are your thoughts and what do you think is the most important piece in reform when it comes to occupational licensing? Now, you did tackle the recognition quite well, and you tackled the criminal justice portion of it, good moral character portion of it. What do you think is next, I guess I would say, or, you know, scope of practice? What's next in cutting this red tape and allowing people to work as immediately and efficiently in your state?
Yeah, great. Well, we've made a lot of progress here. And in fact, 2 years ago, there was another bill that I was able to get across the finish line that was, I kind of call it reciprocity light, but it had a lot of other stuff to it. The reciprocity and recognition piece required that if you're coming from out of state, you have the state that you're coming from has to have substantially similar standards of testing and you know, training that Missouri does. Well, now with the new law, it's totally made that you know, so it's kind of null and void. It's gone beyond that. But in addition to that piece of it, we also had a sunrise provision and a sunset provision, which means that if you are going to create a new license in Missouri, you have to prove that there's a need for it. You have to show specifically that there is a need. It has to basically be approved by the legislature that is indeed something that's necessary, so that we put a stop on this, you know, 1 in 4, and we don't get to 1 in 3 and out of every 2 professions requiring a license. The other thing it does is put a sunset provision on it. So you have to come back every couple of years and you have to do the same thing. Justify how the license and how the requirements that you have are protecting the health, safety, and wellness of Missourians. And my hope is that future legislatures will look in detail at the specific data, because one of the challenges that we have is that the specific requirements have grown and grown and grown and grown. So like in Missouri, cosmetology, they're so easy to pick on, but they have 1,500 hours of required education. And EMS, a trained professional in EMS is 750. And there's so many other professions that you can make the comparison between, you know, a cosmetologist and that other profession. Well, you know, we need to review those on a regular basis and determine whether those required hours are really accomplishing the goal of protecting the safety, health, and wellness. And where they go beyond that, they need to be pared back, or in some cases, they need to be eliminated. So I think the sunset, sunrise provisions are important. Doing a comprehensive review, that's probably next for Missouri, is putting in a requirement that every couple of years we do a comprehensive review. A special committee is formed to look at every single profession that's required to get permission from us and make sure that the requirements are actually in line with other states and are in line with what they ought to be. So if now we have reciprocity and recognition in Missouri, and someone can come from another state where the requirement for cosmetology is maybe 700 hours of education, is it really fair for us in Missouri to require another 800 hours of education beyond what that person coming from another state has? Or is it good enough that they are demonstrating through their work experience that they can do the job?
I think that's really great. And that's a great explanation. I think that the sunset and the sunrise revisions in a lot of states, we've seen a lot of success in them. And it just kind of seems like it's almost common sense, right? To check in every couple of years to see as technology is evolving and, you know, the way that we're living is evolving, like, hey, this is now our interview is via Zoom.
Yes.
So I think that that's a really great point. And I think that's something that all sides, both sides of the aisle can really get on board with, is just a simple review and seeing if these regulations and stipulations and requirements are still necessary in every position. So I really like that answer. And
I also think I didn't mention, but you mentioned the good moral character clauses.
Mm-hmm.
We got rid of those with this bill. There are no more good moral character. We removed them from all professions. And I think that is a good move because you ought to be able to prove it, right? It shouldn't just be a board of other professionals in the industry that you're trying to break into and be competition to them. It shouldn't be up to them to decide whether you have something called good moral character. How is that defined? How do we determine what that is? So, you know, it was really important for us to remove that so that there aren't arbitrary reasons for the government to deny you the ability to work. I mean, the ability to work and have a job is so fundamental to our economy and what has really created the economic superpower that the United States is. If we start restricting the ability of people to work and be productive citizens in our country, we're going to have major problems. And we are already seeing major problems from that. So we have to get away from this.
Absolutely. Thank you. That's, again, great explanation, little tongue tied there on everything. I really appreciate that. I mean, it's so important to not only protect people, of course, that's the reason for licensure, but having that right to work is also extremely important, not just for the economy, but for the physical and mental health of each constituent in each state. And the Show Me state is no exception to that. So thank goodness they have a champion on occupational licensing reform in you. So luckily that they have you on their side. So I will say this interview would have taken place in person if it wasn't for COVID-19. I would have loved to hop on a plane and come back down. I really enjoyed it there. Just for the brief time, I got to experience the snowstorm, but I'm sure Missouri is famous for. But in Western Pennsylvania, we're no strangers to that too.
Yeah, so. I think you guys get a little more snow than we do.
Yeah. But I would be remiss if I didn't bring up COVID-19, of course. And I want to know, has your state implemented any emergency laws for occupational licensing during this pandemic? And if so, what do they look like?
Yes. There were a number of executive orders that the governor signed into law that basically allow for greater mobility of healthcare workers. Obviously, the crisis that we have has highlighted the need for mobility within our workforce. You know, if there is a specific pop-up area where there's a lot of healthcare challenges, like we've seen with COVID-19, you need people that are trained to be able to go in and move there quickly and address that problem. And with healthcare specifically here, you know, if the old system was in place and these executive orders hadn't been made, a lot of these doctors, nurses, physicians, other healthcare professionals would have had to go through the cumbersome and burdensome process of getting a Missouri license to plug in and address the problem that we had here. So the governor was wise enough to see that that was something that we needed to get rid of. And a lot of governors across the entire country saw the same thing. Well, guess what, guys? Now they have shown the the lack of necessity to have a lot of these requirements in place at all, right? If it makes sense for healthcare workers, then it ought to make sense for any other professional as well. So we had telehealth that was, we had an executive order related to telehealth, specific to healthcare professionals, allowing them greater recognition and reciprocity so they can travel. Those were two big ones. Other things that were not directly related to like the healthcare field, but were still important were like remote notary services, right? So for years, we've been trying to pass a bill that allows for remote notary services in Missouri. I think you guys in Pennsylvania already have this passed.
Yes.
But we've been trying to get that done. It makes no sense that you should have to go to a bank or go to a notary when we have the technology to be able to verify identity remotely. Mm-hmm. So this is a crisis that has produced a positive result in allowing for this remote notary, allowing for these telehealth things. So what we're looking at now is which of those need to be made permanent. My feeling is they all do. If they made sense during the pandemic here and they make sense to do it now in a crisis, why not do them all the time so that you don't have to go through this process in a crisis, right? Let's just break down those barriers to entry. Let's just make it easier for people to travel and work. And it creates less friction in labor markets, which is a very, very positive thing. So, you know, the challenges that we've been, everyone on all different levels have been having with the COVID-19 crisis here. There are some positives that are coming about because of what we've been forced to do, you know, some positive trends that are happening. And we just need to continue to capitalize on that and move those forward because they make sense. And the age-old arguments are being just blown apart, Lana. I mean, you know, these industry professionals that have said for so many years, oh, we can't do that, you know, we should be scared about doctors coming from other states and practicing in Missouri, or, you know, somebody who cuts hair in Wisconsin, they might just go crazy when they cut to Missouri, and we know better. Missouri knows better. We need to have our own standards, right? Well, come on, that's garbage. If you break your leg in Colorado and go to the doctor, you expect the exact same care as if you have to go to the emergency room in Missouri. And it's the same way across the United States, across all of these professions. So this has been a great opportunity to kind of open the door on these and debunk a lot of these myths. It's going to be pretty hard for industry professionals. And I'm telling you, with this recognition law, it was pretty hard for people to stand up after we had been in shutdown for a month and a half and try and argue that we need to put more restrictions on people's ability to travel and work.
I was just going to say, now more than ever, I think that industry professionals are now seeing, you know, what it looks like really to fill those seats at the barber shop, or fill those seats, you know, even in the ER for certain injuries. Of course, not for COVID, that's not a problem at all. But to, right. You know, I travel quite a bit, and so it's funny when you said, you know, you break your leg in Kansas, I want to have the same treatment as if I break my leg in Pennsylvania. I travel all over the country, and I feel the same way. I think about those things too. I have to see, you know, where are hospitals at, but I would never even think one state would give me better healthcare than another. I mean, we're all in the same great country. I would never think that one state could have higher quality than another, or even if I had to go and, you know, go to the salon really quick for a quick trip somewhere, I would hope that I would get the same treatment everywhere. So I think that this pandemic is showing people how skills are equal across the board, borders, I guess I should say. At least the standard of the customer or of the patient, we want to have the same standard across the lines there. So I think that it's helping them show that, and I think you really pointed that out nicely.
Yeah.
So are any lawmakers proposing any additional bills this year in terms of legislation to address occupational licensing reform that you know of in Missouri?
Not that I know of in Missouri, but it's really early. I mean, we're going back into special session. We all, I think, across the country and specifically in Missouri, we're focused on some other pressing issues. In Missouri, it's crime and dealing with violent crime. So I think everybody's attention is focused there right now. Thankfully, we got a lot of these reforms passed, you know, back in May and have now signed them into law. So, but I think as we move forward, you know, as I mentioned, one of the big provisions that I want to put in place is a consistent review of the requirements, and have that be an ongoing process that continues in Missouri, because we need to keep chipping away at this. And also looking at, again, cosmetology is a great example, because with 1,500 hours, the research that I've done on this is that the vast majority of those hours are not related to safety, health, and wellness. They're related to providing skills for those people to be good at cutting hair, right? Well, is it the government's job to make sure that somebody is a good, practicing professional? And that's, I know that's kind of a loose term, but, and I should tighten it down on what I mean by good. But, is it the government's job to train people to be good at their profession? I don't think so. I think it's our job to make sure they know the right things to make sure the health and safety and wellness are protected of individuals. But whether somebody knows all of the different styles to cut in hair, I think that's the job of the employer. I think that's the job, just like in many professions, of the individual to go out and obtain those skills. So why should somebody who wants to cut hair in Missouri be required to get permission from the government to make sure they know all of the new hip styles to cut, right? I don't. I think they need to know how to make sure they avoid contagious diseases, to make sure that they're not going to lop off somebody's ear by accident, right? The right procedures to enable that they can conduct that job safely. But beyond that, we ought to get out of the business of training people. I just don't think that's what government's role is.
Right. It's so funny you say that, because anytime that's brought up in cosmetology, in particular, I have to share an embarrassing story with everybody about myself and an experience with a licensed cosmetologist. I was going to get my eyebrows waxed. You all know about that, I'm sure. And I went to a licensed cosmetologist at a salon that I had been going to for years, so this was no different. I'm not sure if maybe she was a bit distracted that day or what was going on, but I left there with only an eyebrow and a half. So I'll put it that way. Yes. And this was right as I was getting into this position on occupational licensing. And to me, just as a consumer who had just paid for a service that was rendered very, very poorly, I would say, I think everybody would agree to that. And I started to study occupational licensing a little bit more. I thought to myself, well, this was a licensed cosmetologist, and it came down to her employer, maybe letting her off that day, or, not training her properly. It was no fault of, the Commonwealth who issued her license, or it didn't matter how many hours she ended up training beforehand. I still walked out with an eyebrow and a half at a licensed salon. So I couldn't agree with you more. I mean, that's the fault of the employer, not the fault of the Commonwealth. Never in a million years, I, as a consumer, thought, let me call Pennsylvania's BPOA commissioner and complain about this. I said, I'm going to call the salon and say, hey, your employee did, this, and this to me, and it's never happened before. I understand. I'm an understanding person, but that was you're exactly right. So that example, I mean, it happened to me personally. Luckily, there's makeup out there that can help me cover it up until it grew back. Just the conclusion of that story. But it was really funny, because it was just when I was getting into occupational licensing and understanding the full scope of it and the realm of it. And I think back to that time, and I said, she was licensed. The salon was also licensed in a separate business license as well. I've been around for quite some time. I've gone there myself quite a few times, but we're all entitled to off days. Like I said, I'm understanding, and that's fine, but you're absolutely right when it comes down to the employer, or even the cosmetology school that she came from. There's definitely certain tips and tricks that you learn there, and those are industry standards. And I think that's a big thing that people get confused, or industry standards, and where the government should come into play. Right. Health, safety, and wellness of the constituents and the consumers and the patients. Yes.
And professional industries have a very important role in the free market society that we have, right? You want these industry groups to come out with standards and their own certifications to show that somebody has the skilled training to be able to do the job and do it well, right? So in Missouri and in most states, all states, I think, there's the Realtors Association, right? So that's the professional industry group for real estate. And if you're a realtor, there are certain standards that you have to abide by. And you have to be, a highly trained individual to do that. Well, that's a good thing. Being a CPA, there's a professional industry organization, again, that provides an extra level of consumer confidence. So to look for that industry's standard and look for the designation that they may be able to get. But it's not, again, the government's job to get into doing that and providing these certifications. And the free market, your example is a great one, because my guess is that you probably did never go back there again.
Sure
right?
didn't. Nope, I
There
did
you
not.
go. So by the free market allowing to work, you eliminate the bad actors, and the competitiveness of an industry will determine who rises to the top, who's successful and who's not. And if somebody is not able to wax eyebrows professionally and well, and they screw it up and they cut off half of somebody's eyebrow, they lose a customer and they lose a client, right? And you're probably going to tell at least 10 of your friends. Now you've told millions and millions of people, because I'm sure we have millions of people listening to this right now.
Eventually, it'll get to millions.
Yeah. And that's how it's supposed to work. That's how our free market society works, not with government coming in and mandating these things that really have no direct bearing on the safety, health, and well-being of the public.
Absolutely, absolutely. And there was a piece that you said, I know that Missouri is really going to be focusing on the crime piece of what's happening. I mean, that's, every state has their issues. That's not an issue at all,
Yes.
or a certain concern at all. It's concern to everyone, right?
Yes.
Not specific to Missouri. But when you said that, something popped into my head immediately. And just thinking about the good moral character clause that you did take out with your bill and addressing that, we know that there are recidivism rates directly reflected on, barriers to entry. And the thing that pops into my mind that's current right now in popular culture is a documentary on Netflix called When They See Us. And, it was about the 5 boys who were wrongfully accused in the Central Park, the terrible, terrible thing that happened with that woman. And there's a scene in there specifically that I have to share with everybody that I think will help people connect how occupational licensing reform will help with crime. There's a certain scene where the one young man, he gets out of the youth prison a little bit earlier than some of his friends. He meets with his parole officer, and his parole officer takes him to a diner and says, you must keep a job or else you will be, you will recidivize and essentially be put back into prison. But you can't have a job here because you can't work next to another felon. That's a restriction. He said, did you ever plan on doing this, this, and this? You ever planned on being a barber? You won't be able to, because in the state of New York at the time, there were licensing restrictions for him to be able to obtain a license with a felony conviction, even though we all know now that they were wrongfully convicted as underage children, essentially.
Right.
But it makes me think of that. And then there's another scene that it jumps to of another young man who ended up getting released as well. And he always wanted to be a teacher. Well, they're kind of walking down the street of New York, and, they have this conversation, and he says to his friend, I've always wanted to be a teacher ever since I was young, but now I can't. I can't be a teacher. I can't get these jobs. I can't even come close to a school because I have this felony record. And it all comes down to those licensing restrictions that happen. And the first young man did end up recidivizing because he could not find a job. And so he ended up turning to selling drugs because he felt that was his only option to provide for himself and his family, and obviously got caught for doing it because being a criminal wasn't in his nature, essentially.
Yeah.
But he did end up going back to prison because of that. And the recidivism rates and the crime rates that happen, I mean, obviously there's other reasons why crime rates happen, of course, but there is this other piece that occupational licensing does play in it. And I think by removing that good moral character clause is going to be a huge step in the right direction to help with criminal justice reform as a whole in every single state. So the fact that Missouri did that, I'm really, really excited. And I am anticipating, excited in a great way, anxiously in a great way, I guess, anticipating to see your crime rates drop and your recidivism rates drop, because you're going to give these people purpose, and you're going to give these people an opportunity to contribute to society, economically, socially, and give them some pride again. I mean, we deem them, you know, rehabilitated when you let them out. So why not let them
Right.
work? And I think that's
Right.
such a key piece that I think people often disconnect when it comes to occupational licensing and the criminal justice piece of it and the crime piece of it. Both, you know, nonviolent and violent crimes, I think are a huge piece. So I'm glad that you had mentioned that that's something you guys are going to be focusing on, because I think this is going to be a huge change with your bill,
Yeah.
and having the Fresh Start Act in it. So
Yes, yes. Well, and keep in mind, a lot of the professions that are licensed, these are blue collar jobs. I mean, these are lower income jobs, most of them. And so if you're taking out, you know, a quarter of all potential jobs, and most of those are a lot of the professions that people coming out of prison might be looking to re-enter the workforce in, you have a big problem that you create, and unnecessarily so. And that's why, you know, the Fresh Start Act is some model legislation that is really effective. We in Missouri have a low recidivism rate already, but I think this is definitely going to have a positive impact in driving it even lower. And we talk so much about, you know, wanting people to integrate after they serve their time and be productive citizens. And then we make it so hard. We create these arbitrary barriers to entry that, you know, that limit them from that ability of like you said, creating the pride of work and being productive. You know, I believe that every person has that inside of them, and if we are crushing that and oppressing that, then that's a real problem that we've got to address. So what I would like to see, the way that we ended up crafting it in Missouri, we had to scale it back a little bit, in that originally we were requiring every single board to go through and list out the specific crimes that would be prohibited, right? And so it would have taken a lot of work on their part. I realize that, but I think that's a positive step, and where we maybe need to go in the future here is, you know, getting to a list of specific things that would prohibit somebody and requiring that there is justification made for how they correlate, right? Like, how does a mortgage fraud conviction relate to cutting hair? You shouldn't be able to prohibit somebody from being a cosmetologist because they had a conviction for mortgage fraud, you know, 10 years ago. That just makes no sense. It makes no sense at all. So we did some good progress, made some good progress here with the Fresh Start Act, but I'm excited to continue that work. And I know there's a lot of people across the country that are looking to continue that as well. I believe in penalties, and I believe in law and order, and there being consequences for your actions. Absolutely. But limiting somebody's access to work, especially when that crime that they committed has no correlation, I think that's a problem.
Absolutely. And when, you know, we in some cases with, you know, district attorneys and state attorneys, we appoint them, but other people, and they earn their spots, but we entrust in the criminal justice system in this country to, once somebody has been deemed rehabilitated, to allow them to reenter into society. That's the reason they are granted parole. So I think that us as US citizens who are on the ground here, who may not be directly involved in the criminal justice system, and especially those who are involved in occupational licensing research and reform, need to make that connection that we're not that different from this system. We need to work together as a unit to ensure, you know, the health and safety of both consumers and constituents, but also that goes for the employees as well as the consumers. I mean, their health and safety is important too. And you as a legislator, I think, protecting that. And when I say health and safety, I mean, yet again, giving them an opportunity to work will thus improve their health and safety and that of their families and communities. So you are, you know, a watchdog for everyone in your district. And I think that, you know, being this champion of legislative reform and occupational licensing legislative reform specifically is a big deal. And, you know, your district 100 is very, very lucky to have you.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that. It's an honor to be able to do it. I mean, you get into public service hoping that you can have an impact for good, hoping that there's an opportunity. And a lot of people, even as elected officials, you know, you're kind of a very small group already, but even within that group, there's even a smaller group that have the opportunity to really affect major positive change. So I'm just absolutely thrilled that we were able to get this done this year. I thought it would take me another couple of years at least to see this come to fruition. So to see it get done this year is really exciting, and I'm excited for what that opens the door to down the road.
Absolutely. And with that being said, I don't want to keep you on too much longer, so I'm going to end on this question. So
Okay.
obviously, Missouri joined several other states in signing this universal recognition. What difference do you think this is going to make for Missourians?
I mean, I think it's going to make a difference for anyone who is looking to move to Missouri or to work in Missouri that needs a professional license. I mean, I think this bill has broad, far-reaching impact. It's going to affect tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of people in the next couple of years. Arizona has already seen a significant number of people that have applied for this license reciprocity. I think the number is well over 1,000, and they've just implemented it. So that's just recently here. And I think more broadly, the impact that it's going to have is now there are 2 states that have passed near full recognition for licenses. That makes it a lot easier for other states to get on board and to start doing that. And the justification for keeping some of those barriers to entry gets a lot harder the more other states do this. So my hope is that this has a domino effect on other states. And I know there's a number of states that have legislation already introduced that have made good progress. And now they can point to 2 states that have done this and done it effectively and shown with data that it works, that this is helping. So that more than, I mean, it's definitely going to have an impact on Missouri. Obviously, it's going to affect a lot of people, but this has the potential to impact millions and millions of people across the entire country.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for everything. Thank you for your time, but most importantly, thank you for your passion and your dedication, not only to your district and your state, but to this country, and leading in an example of universal recognition for occupational licensing, and how you have really been able to reach across the aisle and push party aside, because I do think that's sometimes a barrier, even within a barrier, right?
Yes,
that you were able to push party
yes.
aside and do what was best for the constituents in your state. And I thank you so much for that. And I look forward to seeing what you're going to do next. I'm looking forward to maybe coming down to Missouri, maybe during the summer this time or springtime. I'd love to take a look at, spend some time in St. Louis and things like that and see the arch and everything. So
we'd love to have you. We'd love to have you. Thank
I'm excited
you so much,
to,
Alana.
yes, thank you so much. Excited to talk to you and reconnect with you again. And, just keep on being that champion for justice and that champion for occupational licensing reform that you are. Thank you so much again for your time. And I look forward to speaking with you again soon.
Thank you so much, Alana. Pleasure to be here.